longevity science and what are the implications?
One of the goals of the longevity community is to maximize health span while at the same time doing what we can to make lifespan as long as possible. Rich men get really great healthcare and get to live forever, and the rest of us don't.
What kind of tools have you got in the toolkit?
We have more and more data than ever before. AI is the tool that promises to help us with that absolute avalanche of data. AI is also poised to help us return the human interactions to healthcare in a really important way. And now that we're all walking around with a smartphone in our pocket, that's a phenomenally powerful healthcare device.
Does this mean that aging is going to become trackable?
Treating one symptom actually can end up making the other symptoms better. Do not get your health information from social media. What's the point of being alive? Stay alive and stay healthy until this longevity revolution, backed by science, backed by medicine, actually has a chance to take off.
Welcome to G42 On Air, your front row access to the AI breakthroughs and visionaries transforming our world. From the heart of the UAE, here in Abu Dhabi, G42 is a global pioneer in AI and cloud technologies, tackling society's biggest challenges, from healthcare and energy to climate and the frontiers of space. So how do we turn AI's potential into practice and purpose? Join me, Amandeep, for this special podcast series, exploring groundbreaking innovations, why they matter, the responsibilities involved, and if these solutions can be scaled worldwide to maximize impact for all. AI is transforming the way we live, but what if it could help us transform aging itself? Today's episode takes a deep dive into longevity science, how we're rewriting the rules for a healthier, longer, and better life, perhaps. So, to dig into this, I am delighted to be joined here in the studio by a global leading voice in the longevity movement, Dr. Tiffany Vora, who is expert and Singularity Fellow in Biotechnology at the Singularity University. Welcome, Dr. Tiffany.
I'm delighted to be here for this conversation.
Now, I said perhaps, so I'm going to be on the fence with this. I need a little bit of convincing. But to begin with, let's just go for that big picture and define longevity science and what are the implications?
So longevity is an umbrella term that encompasses two ideas that I think we should separate right off the bat. Those two ideas are health span and lifespan. So lifespan is the number of years that your heart is beating, literally just the number of years that you're alive. Health span is the number of years that you're happy and healthy and productive and pain-free. Those are not necessarily the same number of years. And so one of the goals of the longevity community is to maximize health span while at the same time doing what we can to make lifespan as long as possible.
What do we need to urgently unlearn about aging itself to actually understand this?
The most important thing to unlearn about aging is that it's inevitable and that it's just things falling apart. That is not what aging is. So thanks to a few decades of really excellent longevity, biology, chemistry, and medicine, we understand now that aging is actually a set of about 12 cellular and molecular things that happen at those levels. It's not just things falling apart. We call them the hallmarks of aging. And it turns out that those hallmarks of aging are interrelated in really interesting ways. And here's what's different about aging versus other diseases or disorders we might think about. It seems that in many cases, treating the symptom of aging, so those molecular and cellular changes I just mentioned, actually slows, stops, or reverses the process of aging itself. So treating one symptom actually can end up making the other symptoms better. Now that's fundamentally different from a disease like diabetes, right? Type 1 diabetes. If I give insulin to a type 1 diabetic, they're still diabetic. In contrast with these aging mechanisms that we're talking about, if I change the epigenetic profile of your DNA to look younger, biologically younger, then your cellular inflammation and various other things also tend to look younger as well. So I think that's a really important mindset shift. First of all, it tells us that aging might not be inevitable. It might be something that we can intervene in. Perhaps we have a moral imperative to intervene, some people might argue. And it also means that potentially the future could be very different from the past. And as individuals, as organizations, and as whole societies, that's something that I don't think we're prepared for.
Now, you say that big mindset shift, that aging may not be inevitable. And you mentioned there the hallmarks of aging. It begs the question, monitoring those hallmarks. What kind of tools have you got in the toolkit?
Well, we have a lot of tools. Now, I'll start with the problem and then we'll back into the solutions. One of the big problems today that I think is the key issue in longevity science is to agree on a set of gold standard markers that the entire scientific and medical communities can say, okay, these markers are very reliable. They give us a really reliable biological clock. Now, if we're doing clinical trials or we're doing daily monitoring or anything like that, let's agree to look at those markers because they're giving us the most information about what's actually going on inside your body. So today, there are many of these types of biomarkers. And as I mentioned, there are things like epigenetic marks on the DNA, the length of your telomeres, which are the ends of the chromosomes. There are things like amyloid aggregation. There's a whole bunch of these markers that we could measure either invasively, non-invasively, or even through the data that we make every single day. Things like how you type on your keyboard, the sound of your voice, your gait as you walk. All of those digital biomarkers are actually ones that we produce every single day in the course just of going about our lives and using our devices. So could we use some of those digital biomarkers in addition to biomarkers from spit, from sweat, from cells, from blood that might give us a great deal of information about how aging is progressing in your body versus my body and what each of us could be doing about it?
And the intersection with AI, is it the actual analysis of all the data that's being gathered? Is that the intersection?
Absolutely. So we have more and more data than ever before. They're disparate types of data. They don't necessarily obviously go together or the data take the same form. AI is the tool that promises to help us with that absolute avalanche of data and turning all of those measurements into actionable insights that I can actually understand and use in my daily life. That's the promise of AI. I think also one thing we should think about with AI in healthcare as well, in my opinion, is that AI is also poised to help us return the human interactions to healthcare in a really important way. Today, when I go to see my doctor in the United States, I get 7 minutes with her, and she spends all of that time with her eyes on the screen, her hands on the keyboard. If AI can actually make it so she can look at me and we can talk like people, that gives us a chance to get to something much deeper, to the core of the relationship of healthcare. And I think that's something that algorithms and robots aren't going to replace anytime soon.
And as you say there, it gets to the core of what healthcare is all about and makes your answer applicable across the healthcare spectrum and not just with longevity science. You mentioned there about all the data that's been gathered there, digital biomarkers, the AI intersection. Does this mean that aging is going to become trackable and measurable like other health metrics? Sounds like it already
Yeah, I
is.
mean, that's definitely the goal. The question today, because we're still relatively early in longevity science, is what should we be focusing on measuring that will give us the largest amount of information that we can actually act on? We can measure tons of things. Lots of those things are not actually going to turn out to be that useful. And I think we would rather be spending our dollars and our attention on the most useful metrics for the goals that we have.
So, Dr. Tiffany, you mentioned there the what. What should be measured? Critics would say why. Why should it be measured? Longevity science doesn't have everyone in agreement. It's called elitist science for a reason.
Sure. So you're right. There are a lot of people who think longevity science is about living forever. And yes, there are some voices in the longevity community who do talk about living forever. I am not one of them. For me, it's about being healthy and happy and productive and flourishing as long as possible. And I think when you talk to people about aging, when I go around the world talking to people about longevity and about aging, the mental image most people I talk to have is they're old, they're in pain, they're frail, their friends are dead, their kids don't call them anymore. Nobody wants that future. So that's not the future I'm talking about building. There's another future, possible future, which you pointed out, which is that rich people, specifically rich men, get really great healthcare and get to live forever, and the rest of us don't. And if we're being honest, we already have that kind of healthcare in a lot of places in the world. So I go around the world talking to people and organizations that are building for a different set of possible futures, which is that we use these tools in order to democratize access to longevity, to health span that is much longer. And that way people can, the question at the bottom of the thing here, Amandeep, is what's the point of being alive? What do we want to do with our lives? What do we want to do with the time given with us? For me, that's about impact. That's about joy. That's about making the world better than I found it. And the longer I have to do that, the better the odds are for me that I will be handing to my son a world that is better than the world I got from my parents. The longer I have to learn, the longer I have to meet people, the longer I have to understand, to gain mastery, to try a whole bunch of different things. Sure, that's super different than what generations from us got before. But I think that it's going to be really important because we're coming up on these really important problems in the world. And the more time I have to work on those, the more I'm able to contribute to building a better future.
And I think in your answer there, because there's so much to unpack, you really do answer that distinction between lifespan and health span that you mentioned right at the beginning of our recording. So that explains that the longer we live and living better, fuller lives, not simply longer lives. But to return to the question of a two-tier system, how can we ensure that with innovation, inclusion is baked in?
For one thing that we absolutely have to remember about AI and these algorithms is that often the population, you train your algorithm on a specific set of data from a specific context. The problem comes in when you try to apply that same algorithm to a new context. Often that means that the algorithm doesn't behave as well in the new population or might even cause harm in the new population. So for healthcare, this is a really interesting question for longevity science, because what we're seeing today is very reasonably, from a business case perspective, a lot of these solutions are being tested and sold and built for people who are already healthy, people who are already wealthy, and who have a particular lived experience, right? That makes sense. You start at the top end of the market, you get your cash flow, and then you say, okay, well, I'm going to expand to other parts of the market. But the danger comes in when the people that you trained on have very different exposures, very different genetics, and very different lived experiences to the larger population that you're trying to apply your workforce to. So, for example, I'm thinking about UAE. So in UAE, your workforce is genetically and exposure-wise and lived experience-wise quite different from your elites, right? So if you develop a product for your elites and then try to apply it to everyone else, the odds that it's going to work are not very good. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't try. We should absolutely try. What I'm calling for is transparency, for honesty, and for a chance to say, these algorithms are going to change as we use them. So we need to come back to them and keep saying, are they working? Are they causing harm? Are they causing more divisions? And make sure if the answer starts to become yes, that you stop and you rework the algorithm until you've got that stuff worked out.
So as well as the transparency, we're talking about a fairness and a representative model, drawing on a diverse community in order to feed the model that you then draw on for the learnings.
Or you have a suite of models and you choose which model is best personalized to the individual user, rather than trying to make one algorithm that does everything, which might not work.
So there we're talking about personalized care as well as preventative care.
Yes. Yes.
Intriguing. Again, the critics would argue it's a case of ensuring that this longevity science isn't only available for those who can afford wearables or have access to gene sequencing. We haven't mentioned that yet.
Yes, for sure. The good news is that thanks to Moore's Law and various other technological innovations, that stuff is getting cheaper and cheaper. So, for example, DNA sequencing. Have you had your DNA sequenced?
I haven't.
You haven't?
I haven't.
You have to try the
I
tech.
think it's a journalist in me that
So I've had
skeptical, so convince me.
It's good to be skeptical. I'm a scientist, right? So I remember it's important to be skeptical. I've had my whole genome sequenced twice. And what's interesting to me is that if you remember in the year 2000, 2001, that's when we got the first fully sequenced whole genome draft, more or less fully sequenced. So that took a long time, and it took about 2.7 billion US dollars in order to get that first human genome. Fast forward to the year 2022, which is the last year we have data for, and it's 525 US dollars in order to sequence a whole human genome, which means in 20 years, the cost has gone from the cost of a fancy fighter jet to the cost of a Taylor Swift ticket. And if you want to only sequence what's called your exome, which is the parts of your DNA that we think do something, that's a whole loaded term, but that's 200 US dollars. So that's your Spotify account for the year. So that has gotten so much cheaper that you could very easily ask the question, well, why shouldn't we sequence people? Because it's gotten so cheap, and it should get cheaper still. And there are other examples of this where things have just gotten cheaper and cheaper. And now that we're all walking around with a smartphone in our pocket, that's a phenomenally powerful healthcare device if we have the safeguards in place to make sure those health data are protected, and also if we choose to use them like healthcare devices. So the good news is that already the price points have come down on some of the most powerful technologies that we have. The question becomes, well, that's the marginal cost of these technologies. What do the profit margins look like? Then you start getting back into the territory that you're concerned about, where these products and services in the market will only be affordable by the very rich.
And I think there you also touch on that other note of skepticism that myself as a journalist has, the data privacy,
Yes.
the protection, the ethics around this. Again, a huge criticism from the critics themselves.
Absolutely. And the farther and farther we move into this digital biomarker space, which I find fascinating, the more important I think these privacy issues are. So we already know, for example, there are companies that are monitoring employee emails. Well, it turns out if you look at the content of an email, using certain algorithms, you can tell whether an employee is under a lot of stress, whether they might be suffering from anxiety and depression, and even if they're starting to have cognitive changes that might be indicated of early, very, very early stages of dementia. So there's a real question there. There's already, I would argue, a privacy violation in having your emails read by the company. But now you're giving the company a look into what's actually going on in your body. And if they're able to fire you because you're in the early stages of dementia, even that no one else has noticed yet, that is a really fraught question. And it's not just employers, but insurance agencies and other organizations that could have access to data that would tell us something that we don't even know about ourselves. Now, I'm going to argue the other side for a minute, right? Because we want to be skeptical and take the good view. So I do a lot of work with folks in the insurance industry. In the United States, at least, we have a law on the books that says that employers and insurance agencies cannot discriminate against you based on your DNA sequence. Now, when I talk to the insurance people, they say, how are we supposed to accurately assess risk if you withhold information from us? And frankly, I understand that too, right? If what we really want are accurate, responsive, dynamic models, holding back a whole set of data from that cripples the model. So I can see both sides in this, and this is why this is an ongoing dialogue, and why I think it's so important for folks who are not in healthcare and who are not in tech to weigh in on this, to understand what's going on, what their data could be used for, both positive and negative, and to have an informed opinion about it and be out in the world talking about it. It's so important.
And I do appreciate your very open attitude here that we're unpacking this, really looking at it from all different angles. You use the word accurate data. If we are talking about, for example, that example of early signs of dementia, are those absolutely agreed upon? If they're noticed in someone's email, if they're noticed in the way that they are behaving, is that the issue here? That the medical community isn't necessarily all on board with saying this early sign is leads to be here.
So there are a set of very specific algorithms that are trained on individual biomarkers for individual indications, so very, very narrow. And for each one of those algorithms, they always do these sensitivity and specificity analyses, essentially to say what's the false positive rate, what's the false negative rate, because you need to know both, right? And I would say that we're still early in the adoption curve on this. There are lots of academic studies, lots of academic papers. What I'm not seeing yet is widespread use of these in various different contexts. Now, we also know that some of the tech giants like Amazon and Google, early on in the smart speaker era, which wasn't that long ago, they had embedded within those units healthcare applications. And if you've noticed, none of those have spun out yet. So the question is, the voice commands that I give to Siri, do those not work in a healthcare context? That's possible. Or are they sitting on this data and they haven't decided to release the product yet? And because these are private companies, we don't have a lot of insight into what's going on the inside. But I mean, to be honest, I'm that person who goes around her house unplugging the smart speakers that her husband has put inside without her permission. If Amazon were helping me track my health, I would leave them plugged in. But if all they're doing is selling me ads, I unplug them, right? So this is also interesting dual use technology, if I can use that term here. And I wonder sometimes what if we really understand what we're giving up and what we're agreeing to when we check on I consent in those end user license agreement boxes, when we just want to get to the app.
And I appreciate our conversation here is very comprehensive, and we've taken many different angles here. You've been very open to this. It's fair to say this is an emerging frontier. So perhaps some of the checks and balances that I've mentioned today and longevity science is subjected to, we're still in the very early stages, but there's a lot of promise. But again, how does one distinguish the promise from the hype? Is there some early optimized optimism there that actually probably doesn't warrant the headlines?
So yes, of course, there's a great deal of hype in the longevity field in particular. I can give you some tips and the audience some tips about how to keep your eyes open. So number one, do not get your health information from social media. I don't know how to be any clearer about that. TikTok is not the place you should be getting your health recommendations. So always look to reputable journalistic outlets. There are quite a few out there that do really fantastic health reporting. Also, always look for science. Real science done by real scientists at real scientific institutions. Now, that said, there are some clues that you can look for that give you a hint that maybe something here isn't quite reputable. And these are hints like the cure that the government doesn't want you to know about, or things like that. Like that's a marker, or somebody trying to sell you some kind of ancient wisdom. That's also a hint that you should be paying way more attention and taking a lot more skepticism into the conversation. Now, of course, everyone and their mother has a social media account today. So just because a scientist is on social media doesn't mean that they're not trustworthy. There are plenty of trustworthy people like myself, I hope, out there, but also looking to trusted voices in the field who will give you the real deal and tell you where the science is limited. I believe I am one of those voices. So if you sign up for my Substack, be voracious, or come follow me on social media, you'll see that the articles that I share come from the scientific literature. They come from reputable press outlets. And then I tell you what I see as an independent scientist looking on that. I would also always beware of anyone who wants to tell you about science and then sell you something, because there is an obvious conflict of interest there. It does not mean it doesn't work, but again, it means you should pay a little more attention before you do any sort of purchasing or make any big lifestyle decisions. And of course, talk to your doctor and see what your medical support also thinks about trying these various things. The last piece of advice I'll give is the single most important thing that anybody can do in order to take advantage of this coming longevity revolution is to stay alive now. Do not die now, just as we're getting to the point where longer, healthier lives are possible. So that means things like getting plenty of sleep, exercising every day, whatever kind of exercise you like. I'm not going to tell you what kind of exercise to do, but I am going to tell you to find something you love, preferably that involves other people, and do that every single day. Be mindful of the food that you eat, right? Mostly plant-based diets, mostly whole foods. All of these, we have data showing that really matters. Other simple things like brushing your teeth, not smoking, that includes vaping, and wearing your seatbelt. That is so important. And then, of course, just doing the basic stuff you're supposed to be doing, talking to your doctor every year, getting your vaccinations, taking care of your heart, getting your cancer screening done. All of that will help you stay alive and stay healthy until this longevity revolution, backed by science, backed by medicine, actually has a chance to take off.
And I think that holistic approach, and thank you for sharing so many practical takeaways with our audience, really does address the heart of this. As you say, real science by real scientists at reputable, real scientific institutions. You are one of our trusted voices here, Dr. Tiffany. That's why we have you here today. And that's why it's been invaluable to address some of the question marks when it comes to this emerging frontier. We do want to give this emerging frontier the due attention it deserves. So let's return to where our tech toolkit really is feeding that longevity revolution, as you call it. And let's unpack exactly what could we be seeing in the near future, in the next year or so. What do you think is going to be available to medical professionals to actually monitor aging and actually help us live longer and healthier?
So, what we're seeing today are large data set gatherings of different types of molecular and cellular processes going on in the body. So, we mentioned DNA sequencing already. That's reading off the 3 billion ACs, Ts, and Gs that are on your genome. You can think of that as the permanent source code for the biology of you. But then we can also do things which are called transcriptomics, which is looking at the RNA in your body. You can think of RNA as compiled code. So, what is your body actually doing at this given moment? We can look at metabolites and metabolomics, which is all of the small molecules that your body is making in the course of doing the biology of you. And then we have other types of large data sets, like, for example, there's something called the expososome, which is data about the quality of the air that you're breathing, the water that you're drinking, food that you're eating, pills that you're taking, all of these things that surround you. That is an particularly interesting growing field of research, figuring out how to quantify all of these things that we're exposed to. There's other types of measurements as well. I mentioned epigenetics earlier when we were talking about the hallmarks of aging. Epigenetics, those are the chemical marks that are on your DNA, like highlighter on a textbook. We're getting better and better at measuring those things and then correlating those measurements with biological age. So I would expect to see more and more of these types of measurements in particular from the actual biology. And you'll also see in the news that scientists are getting better and better at getting blood-based biomarkers or spit-based biomarkers, where if you look at particular ratios of things, it gives you insights into stuff like what's your inflammation state, because we know inflammation is a driver of aging, and various other things like that. Or if you are at risk of something like Alzheimer's disease, being able to get a blood test for that instead of a spinal tap. That's a really big deal. I had one of these blood tests and I went to my grocery store in my neighborhood in order to get my blood draw. That is way easier than having to take off from work and go to the hospital and all these various things. Now, I am
brings us around full circle to that accessibility.
Exactly.
And a reach for a more diverse community, not to only receive the benefits, but to feed in their own data to help the algorithms of the AI develop.
Absolutely. And all of those tests that we just talked about, those are all very kind of classical biomedical tests. But then we have the digital biomarker promise, right? My voice, my typing, my gait, all of these things could have data, really rich data about my biological and cognitive states. And so that is a larger gap to close, but there are many, many organizations out there trying to close that gap.
Dr. Tiffany, you've taken us a deep dive into a fascinating and emerging frontier, as we call it. I feel like our conversation is very timely to catch you now while the longevity revolution really is in its infancy. I think it means that we must have you return to the G42 on-air podcast to keep us abreast of all of the developments. And who knows, by then, I may be convinced to do my own gene sequencing.
Well, I would be delighted to return for another conversation, and I would be delighted to do your DNA sequencing with you, so you just let me know how I can help.
And thank you for joining us. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And see you for the next episode of G42 On Air.